Hello and welcome. I'm Fahd Husain. Somewhere tonight, conversations are taking place that may decide whether this conflict moves towards dialogue or slips back towards confrontation. And what makes those conversations important is not just the outcome, but the fact that they are happening quietly, carefully, and under sustained pressure, away from the cameras and away from the noise that usually defines a moment like this. While at the center of those conversations sits Pakistan, carrying a responsibility that seems to be growing by the hour. What we are seeing on the surface is confusing enough, with Iran seizing 2 ships and sending a clear signal that it is willing to raise the stakes at sea, with oil markets reacting sharply and pricing in risk rather than relief, and with the US President Donald Trump announcing that talks could take place on Friday in Islamabad. Yet, even as that date is discussed, there is no clear confirmation from Tehran that it will actually participate, which actually creates a gap between what is being announced and what may realistically happen. And that gap is where the real story lies tonight. The real story is not whether talks are scheduled, but what it takes to make them happen. Because this is not a procedural exercise where invitations are issued and delegations arrive. It is a political process that requires persuasion at a very high level, where positions are not just different but fundamentally opposed, and where every step forward depends on convincing both sides that engagement still serves their interests, despite everything that is pulling them in the opposite direction. Pakistan in this moment is engaged in 2 parallel conversations that are very different in tone and substance. Speaking to Washington with an emphasis on stability to open sea lanes and the need to prevent escalation from triggering wider economic consequences, while also speaking to Tehran in a language that revolves around security, sovereignty, and the need for any process to reflect balance rather than pressure. Which means the task is not simply to pass messages, but to reconcile competing frameworks just enough to keep diplomacy alive. What Pakistan is likely doing tonight is holding both sides close to the consequences of failure, reminding Washington that a collapse of diplomacy could drive energy prices higher, widen the conflict, and complicate its own strategic objectives, while reminding Tehran that engagement offers a narrow but real window to shape outcomes and avoid a confrontation that could become far more difficult to manage if this moment passes, which is a delicate balance that requires urgency without panic and pressure without provocation. The focus, therefore, has to shift from the announcement of talks to the viability of talks, from what is being said publicly to what is being negotiated privately. Because the real question is whether Pakistan can keep both sides close enough to the table for dialogue to remain possible. And that distance is not measured in geography, but in trust, which remains fragile and contested. Tonight we step inside that process, looking at what Pakistan is dealing with, what arguments it is making, what pressures it is absorbing, and how far can it go in holding this moment together as its role expands and the margin for error narrows. So let's take a closer look. Now let's do a deep dive into this issue and try and figure out what are Pakistan's options, what are we looking at, what could we be speaking about when we interact with both the Iranians and the Americans at this very crucial and sensitive juncture. Joining me are 2 guests who are ideally suited to draw upon their own experiences and try and analyze Pakistan's position at this stage. Ambassador Johar Salim is my first guest, Pakistan's former foreign secretary, also former ambassador to Germany, and currently the president of the Institute of Regional Studies in Islamabad. My other guest is Ambassador Asif Durrani. He's been a former ambassador to Iran and UAE, which obviously makes him very well qualified to speak on the current situation, and also he served as Pakistan's special representative for Afghanistan. Again, a very important, sensitive assignment that he did with lots of success. Thank you both for joining us. In fact, Durai Sahab, if I may start with you, we are looking at a situation where Pakistan's role, and I've been speaking about this repeatedly over the past week, that in my opinion, Pakistan's role from what it was as a facilitator has now increased to a mediator, and maybe at this stage what I would call mediator plus, because now we are trying to ensure that both sides come to Islamabad, and we are the sole channel of communication, at least that's what the world is being told. So based on that, obviously it is a very challenging situation for us also, where the second round of talks was about to happen, and then this complication rose up. Now obviously both Iran and the US have given their positions very clearly. One doesn't want to lift the naval blockade, the other doesn't want to open the Strait of Hormuz. So at this stage, Pakistan is trying somehow to get both sides to show some flexibility and come back to Islamabad. What kind of arguments would Pakistan be giving to both sides, in your opinion?
Thank you, Fahd. I think it's a difficult challenge for all the parties. Forget about Pakistan, because Pakistan is still in a comfortable position because it is mediating and it enjoys the trust of both parties. But the difficult situation comes when, as you have rightly mentioned, about US's action in blocking the Persian Gulf, and Iran's now position that they will not lift the siege of Strait of Hormuz, or they won't give free passage. So it's a stalemate, and definitely what your question is, what Pakistan would be doing. I think you have seen already that our Field Marshal visited. He stayed 3 days in Iran. Similarly, Prime Minister visited the 3 states. And then Dar Saab was also our Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. He was also engaged, and he's still engaged. And what you see in Islamabad, the kind of security measures which have been taken, and there are areas which are out of bound, still gives you hope that the dialogue is on. I'm sure the dialogue is on, and I can vouch for that also. But yes, what comes out in the public, that is important, and that's what everyone is waiting for. That who is going to be you are waiting for the white smoke to come out.
Absolutely.
Who will be the new pope? So this is something we are, watching with by holding our breath.
So if we, and you're absolutely right that we are all hoping that some sort of a breakthrough comes about. But Ambassador George Salim, now, given the two positions that we know of, publicly declared positions, Donald Trump saying that they should open the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran saying they should lift the blockade. Now, obviously, if talks have to happen in Islamabad, they have to happen as a result of some flexibility on both sides. Now, obviously, when you look at the public positions, it's very difficult to foresee Trump suddenly saying, okay, I'm lifting the blockade. And equally, it seems almost impossible to visualize Iran suddenly coming out and saying, fine, we are opening the Strait of Hormuz. For Pakistan, the challenge is, can we find some middle way between these two positions? Can we convince the two sides to show some flexibility? So what I'm wondering is, where is the scope for flexibility between these two positions? Can you see any space for that?
Definitely, I do actually. I think the problem is not really the positions. The problem is the mistrust on two sides, perhaps more so on the Iranian side right now, for reasons that I could subsequently detail. But let's say, what are the arguments here? If I were the sort of, in the facilitation, in the Pakistan team, what would I be saying? Number one, one solution could be to have a simultaneous announcement from both sides. Like they lift the blockade and they lift the, they unblock the Strait of Hormuz because, the Iranians are not really capturing it. They're blocking it so they can unblock. Now, the problem there is that Iranians, when they offered to unblock, which their foreign minister had done earlier, Abbas Araghchi, they had done it with a caveat. And the caveat was that there would be a coordinated route, which would, because they won't pass alongside the Omanian coast, the ships had to pass alongside the Iranian coast through designated routes. So that would still leave some control to Iran. That I think is a big stumbling block. Now, I think the American side could be convinced that, okay, if the Iranians are insistent on that, then you could also lift the blockade. And with this caveat, then, okay, the blockade will be lifted, but you would designate a coordinated route. So the ships could only pass through that. So I think that could be one position. Now, what are the other arguments? Let's look at it in terms of the legal arguments. Now, the legal arguments again cut on both sides. For instance, the blockade is illegal. When you have a ceasefire, then as per the rule of armed conflict, you cannot, because then it's considered as a hostile act, as an act of war. So you can't have a block. You can have a blockade during war. There's room for that. There's space for that. But you cannot have it during a ceasefire.
Yeah.
On the Iranian side as well, the legal argument cuts there as well. And how is that? There are two things here. So far as the straits are concerned in the world, there is a right, there are two types of right in the territorial waters. One is the right for innocent passage, right? And the other one is the right for transit passage. Innocent passage, that right you have if they're open seas and you have your territorial waters there. But in the straits, wherever there are choke points, then you have the right of, the ships have the right to transit passage, which means that, because the first right, innocent passage, there's some restriction that could be imposed by the country with the territorial which is whose territorial waters
But the
those
problem
are.
there is that, when it comes to legality, Mr. George Salim, this whole war is illegal. So I don't think the Americans are going to bother too much about international law. That's the whole problem.
True. But the point is, because you've asked for the arguments, no? So arguments you have to give to both sides because both sides are basically leveling charges that the other side's perspective is illegal. So legally speaking, then because of the fact that this is a strait and ships have an unrestricted right, it's an international waterway of transit passage. So Iran cannot block it. Then the other, what are the other arguments? One argument is the economic argument.
Actually, let me come back to that because I think you're right. Let's try and build arguments in terms of what Pakistan could be saying, because we have to essentially, Ambassador Durrani, what Ambassador George Salim is saying, that if both sides really want to find a middle way, there are arguments that can be put forward to justify their position. So, for example, he's given a few examples. Let me just take it forward. For example, if Pakistan were to tell the Americans and the Iranians both that, fine, you don't want to lift your naval blockade because you don't know where this conflict will ultimately end, and the Iranians, of course, don't want to let go of the leverage that they have over the Strait of Hormuz. So perhaps just for the sake of talks, Pakistan could argue that for Americans that, okay, you keep your ships there, but you don't enforce the blockade for the duration of the time that talks are going on. You let ships pass by while retaining your position, your naval position. And again, same argument for the Iranians that, you have leverage, you can shut down the strait, whatever you want. But for the duration of the talks, let the traffic pass by. Do you think this could cut ice, this could provide some sort of an opening for both sides?
Well, it depends on the political will on both sides. And I'm sure these proposals are already, I think, being exchanged by the two sides, even if they are not formally meeting. And so, therefore, whatever we are discussing actually are the possibilities. And as I said earlier, those are being discussed. And only thing is that how they come out in public, what kind of a message they want to convey to the public. Right now, the message is that U.S. continues to hold a blockade in the Persian Gulf, and Iran has stuck to its guns, especially when the United States announced to not to, in fact, lift this blockade once they extended the ceasefire. So here, I think the United States has to show magnanimity. They are a big power. They started the war, and they can end the war even without being, say, humiliated or embarrassed. This war was started by them and at the instigation of Israel. So it is the main thing is that United States is unfortunately is dictated by Israel, and Netanyahu has pulled by Trump by the nose. In the case of Iran, no one is dictating terms to Iran. This is also, you have to make a distinction. It was on, and then there were two occasions. We have been repeating all this, that last year also and this year, it was Israel which instigated and which initiated the war, and it was United States which followed it. So here, I think we have to be fair. It is not a fair game to try to make a balance. It is a war, and the war was initiated by the United States and Israel.
Of course, the initiation is absolutely clear. I mean, it was a war of choice. They've imposed it on Iran, but here we are, George Salim Saab, here we are where, we are stuck in a situation where the world's economy is being held hostage because of this conflict, and then to be a way out of it currently, except for the efforts of Pakistan. Now, I want to come to what we have been doing and what we are doing. The initial days when Pakistan's role was still not highlighted, in those days, George Salim Saab, it was Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, their foreign ministers came here. So we've been working together, these four countries, as we call them the Quad now informally. Then after the first round, Pakistan's role became much more highlighted, and it almost seemed like Pakistan was single-handedly carrying this burden, where the other countries were in the supporting role, including, by the way, China later on. Now at this stage, seeing all this situation very closely, what is the sense you're getting? Is Pakistan's role getting bigger, or do you think at this stage other countries, including the ones that I mentioned, would now jump in and try and help share the burden? What is the sense that you get?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. But just before that, just one point about Israel, which Durrani Saab mentioned. That argument, sort of Americans could turn it on its head. They can say that, look, Israel is, they are a party to this conflict, but they are not on the negotiating table. So we have to negotiate on their behalf as well. So we have to keep their wishes into consideration. And that would be a legit argument, whether we like it or not. Okay, now let's come to Pakistan's role. So far as Pakistan's role is concerned, first of all, I think we are in a difficult situation. It's because we are in a challenging situation. And why do I say that? What Pakistan's diplomacy has accomplished is remarkable. But these diplomatic miracles are very hard to repeat. There's a huge burden of expectations here. There's a burden of sort of, like the whole world is expecting Pakistan to deliver peace. But, there's only so much that you can do, because at the end of the day, it's the parties themselves. And then Israel's being a party complicates the situation further. And then the other parties as well, the Gulf countries, they're a party too, because, even they didn't want to be a party, but now they are a party. Now, Pakistan, from Pakistan's perspective, first of all, we can try to, which we did, bring the two sides to the table. But also we have to if we bring them to the table, we have to ensure that whatever dialogue ensues, then, their positions are closer to than very inception, because otherwise there could be a deadlock or the whole process could break down. So that is there as well. And right now the situation is this, that, okay, let's be very realistic. On the Iranian side, like almost a big part, at least a big part of their leadership has been taken out, has been assassinated. The new people everywhere, whether it's the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of the National Security Council, Bakir Zulkada, or Mohsen Rezai, or Commander-in-Chief of the IRGC, Ahmed Wahidi. And all these people are new, and not just new. They are considered to be relative hardliners compared to their predecessors. So, and the new supreme leader, you need time to settle down. The decision-making process is not very streamlined right now. In fact, people say, and Americans are saying that as well, it's a bit fractured.
So that complicates
it's not very
Pakistan's
easy.
role. That complicates
Exactly.
Pakistan's role because we
That
don't know who
complicates
exactly to speak
Pakistan's
to.
role. Yeah, and on the other hand, on the other side, look at America. Now, when we are dealing with Americans, there's a challenge there as well. The first challenge is that President Trump has this proclivity or this penchant for just coming up with statements, which are totally mistimed sometimes. Because the last statement while the field marshal was there in Iran, some of his tweets and statements, they just vitiated the whole ambience. And I think they put the pragmatists in Iran, they put them on the defensive. And suddenly it became much harder for Pakistan to bring the Iranians to negotiating table.
As someone said, George Saab, that if only Trump were kept away from his phone for a couple of days, peace would happen much sooner.
That would really help. And the second thing is sometimes, and there's some analysts, I'm just saying on the basis of what some analysts have mentioned in the media, that sometimes President Trump can make commitments and then not carry those commitments. So that creates another level of mistrust.
All these challenges.
So in that situation, I think Pakistan's role is very challenging. And I think at this point in time, it will be very useful, very productive if countries which have a huge leverage on Iran in particular, for instance, China, and I'm sure that they would be involved in back-channel diplomacy as we speak. But perhaps a slightly more assertive role.
That would be important at this stage.
Really help.
I think that's an important point, and perhaps all of this is actually happening. What we've discussed today, most likely most of these things are already on the table, where back-channel diplomacy is going on, and other countries are also getting involved. I think Pakistan would welcome all the help that it can get to try and bring both sides to the table here in Islamabad. I'd like to thank both my guests today for joining. Thank you so much. We will now take a break, but when we come, much more about what's happening here in Islamabad. So do stay with us.